The Elephant Island Chronicles presents A Winter Courtship by Sarah Orne Jewett. Foreword by Geo Marone. Narration by 11 Labs. A Winter Courtship by Sarah Orne Jewett. The passenger and mail transportation between the towns of North Kilby and Sanskrit Pond was carried on by Mr. Jefferson Briley, whose two-seated covered wagon was usually much too large for the demands of business. Both the Sanskrit Pond and North Kilby people were stayers at home, and Mr. Briley often made his 7-mile journey in entire solitude, except for the limp leather mailbag, which he held firmly to the floor of the carriage with his heavily shod left foot. The mailbag had almost a personality to him, born of long association. Mr. Briley was a meek and timid-looking body, but he held a warlike soul, and encouraged his fancies by reading awful tales of bloodshed and lawlessness in the far west. Mindful of stage robberies and train thieves, and of express messengers who died at their posts, he was prepared for anything, and although he had trusted to his own strength and bravery these many years, he carried a heavy pistol under his front seat cushion for better defense. This awful weapon was familiar to all his regular passengers, and was usually shown to strangers by the time 2 of the 7 miles of Mr. Briley's route had been passed. The pistol was not loaded. Nobody, at least not Mr. Briley himself, doubted that the mere sight of such a weapon would turn the boldest adventurer aside. Protected by such a man and such a piece of armament, one gray Friday morning in the edge of winter, Mrs. Fanny Tobin was traveling from Sanskrit Pond to North Kilby. She was an elderly and feeble-looking woman, but with a shrewd twinkle in her eyes, and she felt very anxious about her numerous pieces of baggage and her own personal safety. She was enveloped in many shawls and smaller wrappings, but they were not securely fastened, and kept getting undone and flying loose, so that the bitter December cold seemed to be picking a lock now and then, and creeping in to steal away the little warmth she had. Mr. Briley was cold, too, and could only cheer himself by remembering the valor of those Pony Express drivers of the pre-railroad days, who had to cross the Rocky Mountains on the great California route. He spoke at length of their perils to the suffering passenger, who felt none the warmer, and at last gave a groan of weariness. "How fur did you say it was now?" "I do knows I said, Miss Tobin," answered the driver with a frosty laugh. "You see them big pines, and the side of a barn just this way, with them yellow circus bills? That's my 3-mile mark." We got 4 more to make. "Oh, my laws," mourned Mrs. Tobin. "Urge the beast, can't you, Jefferson? I ain't used to being out in such bleak weather. Seems if I couldn't get my breath. I'm all pinched up and wiggling with shivers now. 'Tain't no use letting the hoss go steppity-step this fashion." "Landy me," exclaimed the affronted driver. "I don't see why folks expects me to race with the cars. Everybody that gets in wants me to run the hoss to death on the road. I make a good average of time, and that's all I can do. If you was to go back and forth every day but Sabbath for 18 years, you'd want to ease it all you could and let those thrash the spokes out of their wheels that wanted to." North Kilby, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Sanskrit Pond, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Me and the beasts done it 18 years together, and the creature warn't, so to say, young when we begun it, nor I neither. I really didn't knows she'd hold out till this time. There, get up, will ye, old mar, as the beast of burden stopped short in the road. There was a story that Jefferson gave this faithful creature a rest 3 times a mile, and took 4 hours for the journey by himself, and longer whenever he had a passenger. But in pleasant weather the road was delightful, and full of people who drove their own conveyances and liked to stop and talk. There were not many farms, and the third growth of white pines made a pleasant shade, though Jefferson liked to say that when he began to carry the mail his way lay through an open country of stumps and sparse underbrush, where the white pines nowadays completely arched the road. They had passed the barn with circus posters, and felt colder than ever when they caught sight of the weather-beaten acrobats in their tights. "My gory," exclaimed Widow Tobin, "them poor creatures looks as cheerless as little birch trees in snow time. I hope they dresses 'em warmer this time o' year. Now there, Look at that one jumpin' through the little hoop, will ye?" "He couldn't get himself through there with 2 pair of pants on," answered Mr. Briley. "I expect they must have to keep limber as eels. I used to think, when I was a boy, that 'twas the only thing I could ever be reconciled to do for a livin'. I set out to run away and follow a rovin' showman once, but Mother needed me to home. There weren't nobody but me and the little gals." "You ain't the only one that's been disappointed of their heart's desire," said Mrs. Tobin sadly. "'Twarn't so that I could be spared from home to learn the dressmaker's trade." "'Twould 'a' come handy later on, I declare," answered the sympathetic driver, "bein' as you went and had such a passel o' gals to clothe and feed. There, them that's livin' is all well off now, but it must have been some inconvenient for ye when they was small." "Yes, Mr. Briley, but then I've had my mercies too," said the widow somewhat grudgingly. "I take it master hard now, though, having to give up my own home and live round from place to place, if they be my own child'n. There was Adeline and Susan Ellen fussin' and bickerin' yesterday about who'd got to have me next. And, Lord be thanked, they both wanted me right off. But I hated to hear 'em talkin' of it over. I'd rather live to home and do for myself." "I've got considerable used to boardin'," said Jefferson, "since Ma'am died, but it made me ache long at the fust on it, I tell ye. Bein' on the roads I couldn't do no ways at keepin' house. I should want to keep right there and see to things." "Course you would," replied Mrs. Tobin, with a sudden inspiration of opportunity which sent a welcome glow all over her. "Course you would, Jeffson," she leaned toward the front seat. "That is to say, unless you had just the right one to do it for ye." And Jefferson felt a strange glow also, and a sense of unexpected interest and enjoyment. "See here, Sister Tobin," he exclaimed with enthusiasm. "Why can't you take the trouble to shift seats and come front here long o' me? We could put one buffalo top of the other, they're both wearin' thin, and set close, and I do know but we should be more protected against the weather." "Well, I couldn't be no colder if I was froze to death," answered the widow, with an amiable simper. "Don't ye let me delay you, nor put you out, Mr. Briley. I don't know's I'd set forth today if I'd known it was so cold. But I had all my bundles done up, and I ain't one that puts my hand to the plow and looks back, 'cordin' to Scripture." "You wouldn't wanted me to ride all them 7 miles alone?" asked the gallant Briley sentimentally, as he lifted her down and helped her up again to the front seat. She was a few years older than he, but they had been schoolmates, and Mrs. Tobin's youthful freshness was suddenly revived to his mind's eye. She had a little farm. There was nobody left at home now but herself, and so she had broken up housekeeping for the winter. Jefferson himself had savings of no mean amount. They tucked themselves in and felt better for the change, but there was a sudden awkwardness between them. They had not had time to prepare for an unexpected crisis. "They say Elder Bickers over to East Sanskrit's been and got married again to a gal that's 4 years younger than his oldest daughter," proclaimed Mrs. Tobin presently. "Seems to me it was fool's business." "I view it so," said the stage driver. "There's going to be a mild open winter for that family." "What a joker you be for a man that's had so much responsibility," smiled Mrs. Tobin after they had done laughing. "Ain't you never 'fraid carryin' mail matter and such valuable stuff that you'll be set on and robbed, 'specially by night?" Jefferson braced his feet against the dasher under the worn buffalo skin. "It is kinda scary, or would be for some folks, but I'd like to see anybody get the better of me. I go armed and I don't care who knows it. Some of them drover men that comes from Canady looks as if they didn't care what they did, but I look 'em right in the eye every time." "Men folks is brave by nature," said the widow admiringly. "You know how Tobin would let his fist right out at anybody that undertook to sass him. Town meetin' days, if he got disappointed about the way things went, he'd lay 'em out in windrows, and if he hadn't been a church member he'd been a real fightin' character. I was always 'fraid to have him roused, for all he was so willin' and meechin' to home, and set round clever as anybody. My Susan Ellen used to boss him same's the kitten, when she was 4-year-old. I've got a kind of a sideways cant to my nose, that Tobin give me when we was to school. I don't know's you ever noticed it," said Mr. Briley. "We was scufflin' as lads will. I never bore him no kind of a grudge. I pitied ye when he was taken away. I really did now, Fanny. I liked Tobin first rate, and I liked you. I used to say you was the handsomest girl to school." "Lemme see your nose. 'Tis all straight for what I know," said the widow gently, as with a trace of coyness she gave a hasty glance. "I don't know but what 'tis warped a little, but nothin' to speak of. You've got real nice features like your marm's folks." It was becoming a sentimental occasion, and Jefferson Briley felt that he was in for something more than he had bargained. He hurried the faltering sorrel horse and began to talk of the weather. It certainly did look like snow, and he was tired of bumping over the frozen road. "I shouldn't wonder if I hired a hand here another year and went off out west myself to see the country." "Why, how you talk," answered the widow. "Yes'm," pursued Jefferson. "'Tis tamer here than I like, and I was tellin' him yesterday I've got to know this road most too well. I'd like to go out and ride in the mountains with some of them great clipper coaches, where the driver don't know 1 minute but he'll be shot dead the next. They carry an awful sight of gold down from the mines, I expect." "I should be scart to death," said Mrs. Tobin. "What creatures men folks be to like such things. Well, I do declare." "Yes," explained the mild little man. "There's sights of desperados makes a handsome livin' out of followin' them coaches and stoppin' and robbin' 'em clean to the bone. Your money or your life." And he flourished his stub of a whip over the sorrel mare. "Landy me! You make me run all of a cold creep. Do tell somethin' heartenin' this cold day. I shall dream bad dreams all night." "They put on black crape over their heads," said the driver mysteriously. "Nobody knows who most on 'em be, and like as not, some of them fellows come o' good families. They've got so they stop the cars and go right through 'em bold as brass. I could make your hair stand on end, Miss Tobin. I could so." "I hope none on 'em'll get round our way, I'm sure," said Fanny Tobin. "I don't want to see none on 'em in their crepe bunnets comin' after me." "I ain't goin' to let nobody touch a hair o' your head," and Mr. Briley moved a little nearer and tucked in the buffaloes again. "I feel considerable warm to what I did," observed the widow by way of reward. "There, I used to have my fears," Mr. Briley resumed, with an inward feeling that he never would get to North Kilby Depot a single man. "But you see I hadn't nobody but myself to think of. I've got cousins, as you know, but nothin' nearer, and what I've laid up would soon be parted out, and, well, I suppose some folks would think of me if anything was to happen." Mrs. Tobin was holding her cloud over her face. The wind was sharp on that bit of open road, but she gave an encouraging sound, between a groan and a chirp. "'T wouldn't be like nothin' to me not to see you drivin' by," she said after a minute. "I shouldn't know the days of the week. I says to Susan Ellen last week I was sure 'twas Friday, and she said no, 'twas Thursday. But next minute you druv by and headin' toward North Kilby, so we found I was right." "I've got to be a feature of the landscape," said Mr. Briley plaintively. "This kind of weather the old mare and me, we wish we was done with it and could settle down kinda comfortable. I've been lookin' this good while as I drove the road, and I've picked me out a piece of land 2 or 3 times. But I can't abide the thought of buildin'. 'Twould plague me to death. And both Sister Peak to North Kilby and Miss Deacon Ash to the pond, they vie with one another to do well by me. Fear I'll like the other stoppin' place best." "I shouldn't covet livin' long o' neither one of them women," responded the passenger with some spirit. "I see some o' Miss Peak's cookin' to a farmer's supper once, when I was visitin' Susan Ellen's folks, and I says, 'Deliver me from sech pale-complected baked beans as them,' and she give a kind of a quack. She was settin' jest at my left hand, and couldn't help hearin' of me. I wouldn't have spoken if I had known, but she needn't have let on they was hers, and make everything unpleasant. 'I guess them beans taste just as well as other folks,' says she, and she wouldn't never speak to me afterward." "Do knows I blame her," ventured Mr. Briley. "Women folks is dreadful pudgicky about their cookin'. I've always heard you was one of the best o' cooks, Miss Tobin. I know them doughnuts and things you've give me in times past, when I was driving by. Wish I had some on 'em now. I never let on, but Miss Ash's cookin's the best by a long chalk. Miss Peake's handy about some things, and looks after mendin' of me up. It do seem as if a man o' your years and your quiet make ought to have a home you could call your own, suggested the passenger. I kinda hate to think o' your bangin' here and boardin' there, and one old woman mendin', and the other settin' ye down to meals that likes not don't agree with ye. Lor, now, Miss Tobin, le's not fuss round no longer, said Mr. Briley impatiently. You know you covet me same's I do you. I don't nuther. Don't you go and say foolish things you can't stand to. I've been trying to get a chance to put in a word with you ever since. Well, I expected you'd want to get your feelin's kinda calloused after losin' Tobin. There's nobody can fill his place, said the widow. I do know, but I can fight for ye town meetin' days, on a pinch, urged Jefferson boldly. I never see the beat o' you men for conceit, and Mrs. Tobin laughed. I ain't gonna bother with ye, gone half the time as you be, and carryin' on with your Miss Peakes and Miss Ashes. I dare say you've promised yourself to both on 'em 20 times. I hope to gracious if I ever breathed a word to none on 'em, protested the lover. Tain't for lack o' opportunities set afore me, nuther. And then Mr. Briley craftily kept silence, as if he had made a fair proposal and expected a definite reply. The lady of his choice was, as she might have expressed it, much beat about. As she soberly thought, she was getting along in years, and must put up with Jefferson all the rest of the time. It was not likely she would ever have the chance of choosing again, though she was one who liked variety. Jefferson wasn't much to look at, but he was pleasant and appeared boyish and young-feeling. I do knows I should do better, she said unconsciously and half aloud. Well, yes, Jefferson, seein' it's you, but we're both on us kind of old to change our situation. Fanny Tobin gave a gentle sigh. Hooray, said Jefferson. I was scairt you meant to keep me sufferin' here a half an hour. I declare, I'm more pleased than I calculated on, and I expected till lately to die a single man. 'Twould really have been a shame. 'Tain't nature, said Mrs. Tobin with confidence. I don't see how you held out so long with bein' solitary. I'll hire a hand to drive for me, and we'll have a good comfortable winter, me and you and the old sorrel. I've been promisin' of her a rest this good while. Better keep her a-steppin', urged thrifty Mrs. Fanny. She'll stiffen up, master, and disappint ye come spring. You'll have me now, won't ye, sartin? Pleaded Jefferson to make sure. You ain't one of them that plays with a man's feelin's. Say right out, you'll have me. I suppose I shall have to, said Mrs. Tobin somewhat mournfully. I feel for Mrs. Peake and Mrs. Ash, poor creatures. I expect they'll be hard-shipped. They've always been hard-worked, and may have kinda looked forward to a little ease, but one on 'em would be left lamentin' anyhow, and she gave a girlish laugh. An air of victory animated the frame of Mrs. Tobin. She felt but 25 years of age. In that moment, she made plans for cutting her Briley's hair and making him look smartened up and ambitious. Then she wished that she knew for certain how much money he had in the bank. Not that it would make any difference now. He needn't bluster none before me, she thought gaily. He's harmless as a fly. Who'd have thought we'd done such a piece of engineerin' when we started out? Inquired the dear one of Mr. Briley's heart, as he tenderly helped her to alight at Susan Ellen's door. Both on us, just the least grain, answered the lover. Gimme a good smack now, you clever creature. And so they parted. Mr. Bailey had been taken on the road in spite of his pistol. The end. From all of us here at the Elephant Island Chronicles, we hope you have enjoyed this short story by Sarah Orne Jewett. Until next time, stay curious.